When the family discovered that the Mafia boss demanded one of his daughters as payment for the debt, they sent the fat daughter they kept hidden out of shame, as if she were discarded trash in the cruelest way they could imagine, without knowing they were delivering exactly the rarest treasure that the feared mafioso dreamed of finding. The black envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, discreetly left at the door of the Montero mansion by a man in a dark suit who disappeared before anyone could see him clearly. When Carlos Montero opened the seal with trembling hands, sweat was already running down his forehead. He knew exactly who had sent that message: Vittorio Russo. The name echoed through the city streets like a dangerous whisper. At 35 years old, he had built a crime empire that extended across 3 states. No one dared to cross his path. No one dared to fail to pay their debts, and Carlos Montero owed a lot, much more than he could pay. The letter was short and direct. Vittorio demanded 500,000 or one of his daughters as payment. The family had 48 hours to decide. His men would come on Thursday night to collect the payment. There was no room for negotiation. Carlos called his wife Helena and the 2 older daughters to the living room. Elena Beatriz, the 26-year-old firstborn, sat with the perfect posture she had learned since childhood. Isabella, 24 years old, adjusted her dress with the natural elegance that always accompanied her. The 2 were the pride of the family, beautiful, slim, elegant, and desired by many prestigious men. Carlos extended the letter with trembling hands. Helena read aloud, and as the words came out of her mouth, the color disappeared from her face. The daughters exchanged terrified looks when the mother reached the part where Vittorio Russo demanded a daughter as a form of payment. The silence that followed was broken by Ana Beatriz's sobs. Isabella began to cry, and in a few seconds the entire room echoed with the sound of despair. The family had no way to pay that amount. They had lost everything in recent failed businesses. That's when Helena had an idea. Her eyes lit up with a morbid satisfaction that only truly cruel people can feel. She whispered a name that made everyone stop crying instantly: Sophia. The name hung in the air like a perfect solution to an impossible problem. Sophia wasn't in the room during this conversation. She never was. The Montero family kept her in the back of the house, away from visitors, away from social events, away from any situation where she could embarrass them. At 23 years old, Sophia had become the family's best-kept secret. Not because she was disobedient or rebellious, but because her body didn't fit the standards her family considered acceptable. Sophia was fat, and for the Monteros, this was an unforgivable flaw. While her sisters paraded at parties and balls, Sophia spent her days taking care of the sick grandmother, cleaning the rooms no one wanted to clean, cooking the meals everyone ate but no one thanked. It was always she who assumed the most difficult responsibilities, the tasks no one else wanted to do. At that moment, she was in the grandmother's room, applying cold compresses to the lady's forehead. She could hear agitated voices coming from the living room, but she was used to it. Her family always argued about money, about business, about problems she was never invited to know about. The truth about Sophia Montero was too complex to fit into her family's limited perceptions. She wasn't just the fat daughter they hid. Sophia possessed a sharp intelligence, an unwavering sense of justice, and a genuine kindness that contrasted violently with her family's cruelty. 3 years earlier, when she discovered that her father was accepting bribes from corrupt businessmen, it was Sophia who anonymously delivered the evidence to the authorities. The resulting scandal cost the family a series of lucrative businesses. Carlos never discovered it had been her, but punished her anyway, further reducing her freedom. The following year, she exposed a scheme where her mother and sisters were embezzling donations from a charity to buy clothes and jewelry. Again, her intervention cost the family money. The pattern repeated constantly. Sophia saw an injustice, investigated on her own, and took steps to correct it without caring about the consequences for her corrupt family. But what she didn't know was that, at that exact moment, in the living room, Her family was deciding her fate in the cruelest way possible. Carlos considered Helena's suggestion with growing attention. The idea was tempting. Sofia was a constant reminder of shame for the family. They hid her at parties, made up excuses when someone asked about her, pretended they had only 2 daughters. Helena argued that Vittorio had asked for one of his daughters without specifying which. Sofia was technically a Montero daughter, even though they preferred to forget that fact most days. Anna Beatrice and Isabella stopped crying immediately when they understood the plan. The solution was perfect. They would get rid of the debt and Sofia at the same time. Carlos walked back and forth, hands clasped behind his back. Vittorio Russo would be furious when he discovered the type of payment he had received. He would feel deceived, but Helena argued that it didn't matter. The debt would be paid. He would have received a Montero daughter, as he asked. It wasn't their fault if he expected something different. Anna Beatriz added cruelly that when Vittorio discovered the type of merchandise he had received, the problem would be his, not theirs. Sofia would be the mafioso's responsibility. The plan was simple and devastating. They would deliver Sofia to Vittorio Russo as payment for the debt, without mentioning that she was the daughter they kept hidden, the one they considered inadequate, the family's shame. Carlos smiled cruelly, imagining Vittorio's reaction. When the powerful crime boss discovered he had received the fat daughter as payment, it would be too late. He couldn't return the payment without appearing weak before his subordinates. Helena observed that the best of all was that Sofia would stay with him, away from them, forever. What they didn't know was that outside the room, Sofia had stopped taking care of the grandmother and was leaning against the hallway wall, listening to every word of the conversation through the half-open door. Her heart was beating so hard she feared someone could hear it. The family's words echoed in her mind like stones thrown on a calm surface. His problem, fat daughter, merchandise, family's shame. That's how they saw her, as a disposable object, as trash to be dumped in the first convenient place. Sofia closed her eyes and rested her forehead on the cold wall. For 23 years, she had tried to win the love and respect of her family. She had taken care of the sick grandmother when no one else wanted to, assumed the most difficult tasks of the house, tried to be an obedient daughter. But none of that mattered because she had committed the unforgivable crime of not having the body they wanted her to have. The tears she had been holding back for years finally began to run down her face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a painful liberation. Finally, she understood that she would never be loved by those people, no matter what she did. For them, she would always be the family's defect, the daughter who was born wrong. But as she wiped the tears with the back of her hand, Sofia made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to get rid of her so desperately, if they considered sending her to a mafioso an adequate solution, then she would face her destiny with dignity. She wouldn't go to that man as a victim. She would go as a woman who finally understood her own value, regardless of her family's opinion. And if Vittorio Russo rejected her, if he returned her as defective merchandise, at least she would have the dignity of not having pretended to be something she wasn't. While the Monteros planned their supposed perfect solution, 15 kilometers away, in the heart of the city, Vittorio Russo was finishing a meeting with his main henchman. The room where they met was decorated with discreet luxury, dark wood, genuine leather, works of art worth fortunes, nothing ostentatious, but everything of the highest quality. That's how Vittorio operated. Silent power, contained strength, luxury that didn't need to scream to be recognized. At 35 years old, Vittorio had built his empire with a combination of strategic intelligence, calculated cruelty, and a code of honor that few in the criminal world still maintained. He was feared, respected, and surprisingly admired by those who knew his story. Vittorio hadn't been born into crime. His family had been destroyed by corrupt businessmen when he was only 15 years old. His father, an honest merchant, had been deceived in a deal that cost everything they owned. Unable to deal with the shame and despair, the man had taken his own life. Vittorio and his mother were left in misery. She worked to exhaustion to support them, and died only 3 years later, consumed by illness and excessive work. At 18 years old, Vittorio was alone in the world. That's when he made a choice that would change his life forever. If the world was cruel and unjust, if honest men were destroyed by the corrupt, then he would become strong enough to never be destroyed again. He entered organized crime, but unlike many others, Vittorio maintained a strict moral code. He never got involved with drugs, prostitution, or any business that harmed the vulnerable. His empire was built on loans, protection, and businesses that operated in the shadows of the law, but never crossed certain lines he considered impassable. And there was something else about Vittorio Russo that few knew. Under the facade of the relentless mafioso, there was a deeply lonely man who dreamed of something that money and power couldn't buy, a true companion, someone who saw him not as the feared crime boss, but as the man he really was. But that was a dream Vittorio had learned to bury deep. Women approached him out of fear or greed. None ever looked at him and saw beyond the reputation and power. When he made the demand to the Monteros, a daughter in exchange for the debt, it wasn't out of real desire. It was a test, a way to punish Carlos for his arrogance and dishonesty. Vittorio expected the family to beg for mercy, for Carlos to humiliate himself, for the beautiful and spoiled daughters to show their true cowardly character. What he didn't expect was that the family would actually send a daughter, much less that this daughter would be Sofia. On Thursday night, 2 black cars stopped in front of the Montero mansion. 4 men in dark suits got out, all with the rigid posture of those accustomed to violence. Sofia was ready. She had spent the last 2 days in a state of silent preparation. She packed her few possessions in a small, worn suitcase that had belonged to her grandmother. She didn't have many clothes. The family had never invested in her wardrobe as they did with her sisters, but she made sure each piece was clean and well pressed. More important than the clothes, Sofia had spent hours reflecting on how she would face what was to come. She had decided she wouldn't bow her head, wouldn't cry, wouldn't beg. She would go with dignity. Carlos opened the door before the men could knock. His nervousness was visible. Helena and the sisters watched from afar, hidden in the living room, cowardly avoiding facing what they were doing. The leader of the henchmen, a tall, muscular man named Marco, entered without asking permission. His eyes scanned the house with professional efficiency before settling on Carlos. Carlos indicated Sofia, who was standing in the entrance hall with her suitcase at her feet. Her posture was erect, her chin raised, her eyes dry. There was no plea in her expression, only a dignified acceptance of what was to come. Marco looked at Sofia with clear surprise on his face. He obviously didn't expect that. The Montero family was known for having 2 beautiful and elegant daughters. The woman before him didn't fit that description. She was fat, her clothes were simple, her hands showed work calluses. Marco immediately realized something was wrong with that situation. The family was trying to deceive Vittorio Russo. That was suicide. But Marco said nothing. It wasn't his place to question. He just took Sofia's suitcase and indicated the door. Sofia followed without looking back. She didn't say goodbye to the family. There was nothing to say to people who treated her like disposable trash. The only person who tried to say goodbye was the grandmother, who had managed to get out of bed and was leaning on the stair railing. The old lady had tears in her eyes and murmured something Sofia couldn't hear completely, but which sounded like a blessing. Sofia got into the car. Marco sat next to the driver, and 2 other men occupied the side seats, surrounding her. The car departed in silence. Throughout the entire trip, Sofia maintained her composure. She looked out the window, watching the city pass by, knowing her life was changing completely and there was no going back. The men in the car didn't speak to her, but Marco watched through the rearview mirror with an expression that seemed almost worried. He knew Vittorio Russo wouldn't react well when he discovered what the Monteros had done. The question wasn't whether Vittorio would be furious, it was what he would do with that fury. The car stopped in front of a mansion on the outskirts of the city. It was an impressive property, surrounded by high walls and elaborate iron gates. Everything screamed power, wealth, and danger. Sophia was led through an impeccably maintained garden to the main entrance. The house was even more luxurious inside. Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, furniture that probably cost more than her family had earned in years. But Sophia barely noticed the luxury. Her attention was focused on the man waiting in the main room. Vittorio Russo was standing near the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He turned when she entered, and Sophia felt the impact of that look like a physical blow. He was tall, well over 6 feet, broad shoulders under a perfectly cut suit, dark hair combed back, revealing a face with striking features, strong jaw, straight nose, lips that seemed to rarely smile. But it was his eyes that impressed Sophia most. They were dark, almost black, and carried an intensity that made the air around seem heavier. Eyes that had seen too much, that carried secrets and violence, but also something more. A depth that Sophia didn't expect to find. For a few seconds, Vittorio just looked at her in silence. Sophia could see his expression changing. Initial surprise, then confusion, and finally a cold anger that made the men around her instinctively recoil. Vittorio placed the glass on the table with a controlled movement, but Sophia realized he was using all his willpower not to crush it. He walked in a circle around her, examining her as if she were defective merchandise. The humiliation of the moment burned, but Sophia kept her head up. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Finally, Vittorio stopped in front of her. His voice, when he spoke, was low, controlled, but loaded with a fury that made Sophia feel a chill run down her spine. Vittorio ordered Marco to explain. The henchman, visibly nervous, told how Carlos Montero had presented Sophia as payment for the debt. He mentioned that the family had obviously tried to deceive him, sending the daughter they kept hidden instead of the beautiful sisters who paraded in society. With each word from Marco, Vittorio's expression became darker. When the henchman finished, Vittorio dismissed all the men with a gesture. They left quickly, leaving Sophia alone with the furious mafioso. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vittorio walked back and forth, clearly trying to control his anger. Sophia could see the muscles in his jaw contracting, his fists opening and closing. Finally, Vittorio stopped and looked directly at Sophia. He asked bluntly if she knew her family had tried to deceive him, if she was aware they had sent her as if she were trash, a cruel joke at his expense. Sophia answered calmly that yes, she knew exactly what her family had done. She had listened to the entire plan. Vittorio asked why she agreed to come. Sophia explained she had no choice, but also that she had nothing left to lose. Her family already treated her as if she didn't exist. Being sent to a stranger, even a dangerous one, wasn't much different from the prison she already lived in. The brutal honesty of the answer seemed to surprise Vittorio. He asked if she wasn't afraid. Sophia admitted that yes, she was afraid. But afraid of what exactly? Of dying. Her life with the family was already a form of death. At least here, there would be the possibility of something different, even if it was just a quicker death. Vittorio was silent for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Sophia feel as if he were seeing straight through her. There was something about this woman that didn't fit what he expected. She should be crying, begging, desperate. Instead, there was a dignity, an inner strength he didn't expect to find. Vittorio finally declared she would stay, not because he accepted the family's attempt at deception, but because returning Sophia would be admitting the Monteros had managed to play a trick on him. That was unacceptable. Sophia would be kept as payment, but he made it clear this didn't mean he was satisfied with the deal. He called a woman named Rosa, the housekeeper, and ordered her to prepare a room for Sophia. Rosa was a middle-aged lady with kind eyes that contrasted with the harshness of the house. She led Sophia to the second floor, to a room at the end of the hallway. The room was surprisingly comfortable, large, well-furnished, with a bed that seemed absurdly soft compared to what Sophia was used to. Rosa showed her the private bathroom and briefly explained the house rules. Sophia would be confined to the room and the permitted areas of the house. She couldn't leave the property. She couldn't make calls. She couldn't have contact with her family. Essentially, she was a luxurious prisoner. Rosa left her alone, and for the first time since this whole situation began, Sophia allowed herself to process what had happened. She was in the house of one of the most dangerous men in the region, a man known for his cruelty with those who betrayed or deceived him, and her family had tried to do exactly that, deceive him, use Sophia as a cruel joke. Sophia didn't know what the future held for her, but one thing was certain. Her old life was over. For better or worse, this was her reality now. The first days in Vittorio's mansion were strange and tense. Sophia saw the mafioso only briefly, usually from a distance. He left early and returned late, always surrounded by his men, always with that somber expression that seemed permanent. When their paths crossed, Vittorio ignored her completely. It was as if she didn't exist. Sophia didn't know if this was better or worse than hostile attention. Rosa, the housekeeper, was the only person who spoke to Sophia. The older woman was kind, but clearly loyal to Vittorio above all. She brought Sophia's meals, made sure she had everything she needed, but maintained a professional distance. Sophia spent her days reading books from the mansion's extensive library, looking out the window at gardens she wasn't allowed to explore, and trying not to think too much about the uncertain future. It was on the 5th day that something changed. Sophia was in the library when Vittorio entered unexpectedly. She stood up immediately, instinctively fearful, but he just looked at the book she was reading. It was a volume on moral philosophy. Vittorio seemed surprised. He commented dryly that he didn't expect her to know how to read, much less that she would choose something so complex. The insult was clear, but Sophia didn't lower her eyes. She responded calmly that her family might consider her a shame, but had never denied basic education. Vittorio asked if she liked to read. Sophia admitted that yes. Books were her only escape when she lived with the family. They were worlds where she could exist without being judged by her appearance. Something in her answer seemed to touch Vittorio. His hardened expression softened slightly. He said she could use the library whenever she wanted, but then left without saying anything more. It was a small moment, but significant. It was the first time Vittorio treated her as something beyond an irritating inconvenience. In the following days, Sophia noticed Vittorio began to appear in the library more frequently. He never spoke much, just picked up a book or some documents and worked in silence, but his presence was becoming less hostile, more tolerant. It was one afternoon, 2 weeks after her arrival, that the incident happened that would change everything between them. Sophia was in the back of the house, in an area she technically had permission to access. There was a small herb garden that Rosa cultivated for cooking. Sophia had offered help, and the housekeeper, surprised but grateful, had accepted. Sophia was kneeling among the plants when she heard agitated voices coming from the house. She recognized Vittorio's voice, louder than normal, clearly irritated. And there was another voice, of a man Sophia didn't know. She didn't intend to spy, but the voices were loud enough that she couldn't avoid hearing. The other man was reporting about a problem in the business. Apparently, one of Vittorio's partners was embezzling money, and worse, was involving children in forced labor schemes. Vittorio's voice when he responded was ice-cold, with a fury that made Sophia shiver even at a distance. He ordered the man to be brought to him immediately. When the henchman left, Sophia heard something fall and break inside the house. She should have returned to her room, should have pretended she hadn't heard anything. But something about the situation bothered her deeply. Children being exploited, forced labor. These were exactly the type of injustice Sophia could never ignore. Before she could think better, Sophia stood up and entered the house. She found Vittorio in the main room, a broken glass on the floor, his hands trembling with contained rage. When he saw her, his expression became even darker. Vittorio demanded to know what she was doing there, if she was spying on his conversations. Sophia answered honestly, Yes, she had heard. Not intentionally, but the voices were loud, and she wanted to say something about what she heard. Vittorio took a threatening step toward her. His voice was dangerously low when he asked what exactly she thought she had the right to say about his business. Sophia knew she was crossing a dangerous line, but something inside her, that same sense of justice that always got her into trouble, didn't allow her to stay silent. She said she heard about children being exploited, and that if he was really going to do something about it, she wanted to help. She had experience gathering evidence, documenting crimes. She had done it before against her own family. Vittorio became completely still. He looked at Sophia as if she were an alien creature that had just landed in his room. No one had ever offered to help him. No one had ever voluntarily approached his business, especially not to fight an injustice. He asked, with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity, why she would do that. Sophia simply replied that she couldn't ignore children being hurt. It didn't matter who the man beside her was. It didn't matter that she was practically his prisoner. Some things were more important than fear. The silence that followed was loaded with tension. Vittorio continued looking at Sophia, and she could see something changing in his expression. The anger was giving way to something different. Curiosity, intrigue, and perhaps, just perhaps, a reluctant respect. Finally, Vittorio did something that surprised them both. He agreed. He said she could help, but warned that if she betrayed him, if she used this against him in any way, the consequences would be severe. Sophia nodded. She understood the risks perfectly, but she also knew that for the first time since she arrived, Vittorio was really looking at her, seeing her as a person, not just as the inconvenient payment of a debt. That was the moment when something fundamental changed between them. Vittorio began to see Sophia not as the fat daughter who was sent to humiliate him, but as a woman with courage, integrity, and an inner strength he never expected to find. And Sophia began to see that behind the facade of the cruel mafioso, there was a man with his own code of honor, someone who also couldn't tolerate certain injustices, even living in a world of crimes. But there was still a long way to go before either of them could admit they were beginning to feel something deeper. In the following weeks, Sophia and Vittorio developed an unexpected partnership. He had discovered that the traitorous partner, a man named Dante, was using orphaned children in smuggling schemes. The children were forced to carry illegal goods because they were less suspicious, and when they were caught, Dante simply abandoned them to their own fate. It was exactly the type of operation Vittorio despised. His criminal empire had clear rules: never involve children, never exploit the vulnerable, never cross certain lines that would separate him from true monsters. Sophia proved to be surprisingly useful. She had a sharp, analytical mind, capable of connecting dots that others missed. More importantly, she had genuine empathy that helped her understand the victims, to predict where Dante might be recruiting more children. Vittorio began to summon her to meetings with his most trusted men. At first, the henchman looked at Sophia with poorly disguised contempt. The fat woman the Montero family had sent as an insult to the boss. But gradually, as they witnessed her intelligence and her real contribution to dismantling Dante's operation, respect began to grow. Marco, the henchman who had picked up Sophia at the Montero mansion, was the first to change his mind. He commented to Vittorio that the woman had more courage than many men he knew. Anyone in her position would be trying just to survive, but Sophia was actively trying to help children she had never met. Vittorio didn't respond to the comment, but Marco noticed the boss began to look at Sophia differently, no longer with anger or disdain, but with growing curiosity. The conversations between them began to extend beyond business. After long meetings, when everyone else had already left, Vittorio and Sophia remained in the library, discussing strategies, but also beginning to share fragments of their lives. Sophia spoke about what it was like growing up being the hidden daughter, the family's shame, how she developed her sense of justice precisely because she had been a victim of so much injustice, how she learned that when no one defends you, You have to learn to defend others." Vittorio surprisingly began to share too. He spoke about his father, the honest merchant destroyed by corrupt businessmen, about his mother, who worked to death trying to support them, about how he entered crime not out of greed, but for survival, and how he maintained certain lines he would never cross, even when it meant earning less money. Sofia realized that Vittorio Russo wasn't the monster his reputation suggested. He was a complex man, shaped by tragedy, living in a world of moral grey, but still trying to maintain some form of code of honor. And Vittorio realized that Sofia Montero was extraordinary, not despite her appearance, but because of who she was inside. Her courage, her compassion, her refusal to accept injustice passively. She had an inner strength that most of the beautiful people he knew didn't even dream of possessing. It was one night, 6 weeks after Sofia's arrival, that everything changed definitively between them. They had finally gathered enough evidence against Dante. Vittorio had confronted the traitor in a tense meeting, with Sofia present at his request. She had compiled all the documents, all the evidence of child exploitation. Dante had tried to argue, but faced with the evidence and Vittorio's icy fury, he had no choice but to admit. Vittorio banned him from his territory, confiscated all his assets, and more importantly, freed all the children Dante had exploited, ensuring they were placed in appropriate institutions. After everything was over, Vittorio and Sofia were alone in the library, the tension of the last weeks finally dissipating. Vittorio served 2 glasses of wine, something he had never done before. He offered one to Sofia. They toasted in silence. The first drink they shared as, what exactly? Partners? Allies? Something more? Vittorio broke the silence. He admitted that when she arrived, he was furious. He felt insulted, deceived. He saw Sofia as the personification of the Monteros' attempt to humiliate him. But in recent weeks, his perspective had changed completely. Sofia wasn't the fat daughter sent as a joke. She was the most upright and courageous woman he had ever met. She had qualities he had searched for all his life without finding. Sofia felt her heart race. She admitted that her perspective had also changed. She had arrived expecting to find a monster. Instead, she found a complex man, yes, involved in illegal activities, but with a moral code that many supposedly honest people didn't possess. Vittorio approached. He asked if he could be completely honest. Sofia nodded, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Vittorio confessed he was falling in love with her. Not with the idea of her, not out of convenience, but with the real woman she was. For her strength, her compassion, her refusal to be broken by circumstances. He never expected the Monteros' attempt to insult him would result in finding exactly what he had always dreamed of. Tears filled Sofia's eyes. Throughout her life, she had been rejected because of her appearance. Her family hid her, shamed her, finally discarded her like trash. She never imagined someone could see her, really see her, and love her for what they found. Sofia admitted she was also falling in love, for his honesty, for the way he had treated her with respect since they began working together, for the way he made her feel valued, seen, important. Vittorio asked if he could kiss her. In response, Sofia closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if both were afraid of breaking the moment. But then it deepened, loaded with weeks of growing tension, denied attraction, emotions both had tried to suppress. When they separated, Vittorio held Sofia's face in his hands. He said he wanted her in his life, not as payment for a debt, not as a prisoner, but as his companion, his equal. He asked if she would stay voluntarily, knowing exactly who he was and what he did. Sofia answered yes. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, and she chose to stay with the man who saw her for what she really was. 3 months later, Carlos Montero appeared at Vittorio's property. He wasn't invited, he wasn't expected, and he definitely wasn't welcome. Sofia was in the garden when she saw the familiar car coming up the road. Her first instinct was panic, but then she remembered she was no longer the rejected and vulnerable daughter. She was Sofia Russo, companion of the most powerful man in the region, a woman who had found her own strength. Vittorio came out of the house hearing the commotion. He positioned himself naturally beside Sofia, his presence a silent reminder that she was no longer alone in facing her family. Carlos got out of the car with an expression that mixed nervousness and forced arrogance. He tried to smile at Vittorio, but the mafioso didn't return it. He simply looked at Carlos with the same icy expression he used with enemies. Carlos tried to begin with forced politeness. He greeted Sofia as if the last months hadn't happened, as if he hadn't sent her like disposable trash. Vittorio cut through any falseness. He asked directly what Carlos wanted. The man finally admitted the truth. The family was in deeper financial trouble. The businesses had completely failed. They needed help. Carlos suggested that perhaps, given that Sofia now lived with Vittorio, she could intercede, use her position to help the family. The silence that followed was loaded with dangerous tension. Sofia could feel Vittorio becoming rigid beside her, anger emanating from him in almost tangible waves. But before Vittorio could speak, Sofia took a step forward. Her voice when she spoke was calm, but loaded with a strength that made Carlos instinctively recoil. Sofia said she wanted to clarify some points. First, she wasn't there as a prisoner or payment. She was by her own choice, as Vittorio's companion. Second, the only reason she was alive and happy was because her family had tried to use her as an insult without knowing they were delivering exactly what Vittorio was looking for. Carlos tried to interrupt, but Sofia continued. She reminded him how the family hid her for years, how she was treated as a shame, how she was finally discarded when it became convenient. They didn't send her out of love or concern. They sent her because they wanted to get rid of her and the debt at the same time. Sofia declared she wouldn't help financially, not because she had no compassion, but because helping them would facilitate the continuation of the same corrupt practices she always criticized. They made their choices. Now they should live with the consequences. Carlos turned red with anger and humiliation. He tried to appeal to Vittorio, suggesting he control his woman, put her in her place. It was a fatal mistake. Vittorio took a threatening step toward Carlos. His voice when he spoke was dangerously low. He made it clear that Sofia didn't need to be controlled. She was his equal, his companion, and had more courage and integrity than any man he knew, certainly more than a coward who sent his own daughter as if she were trash. Vittorio informed Carlos the debt was paid. Sofia was no longer part of the transaction, but he added a warning. If Carlos or any member of the Montero family tried to contact Sofia again, if they tried to use her name or position, if they tried to cause any kind of trouble, the consequences would be severe. The threat didn't need to be elaborated. Carlos knew exactly what Vittorio Russo was capable of. He returned to the car quickly, leaving without looking back. Sofia watched the car disappear down the road. Vittorio put his arm around her, and Sofia leaned against him, feeling a sense of closure she never thought would be possible. She was no longer the rejected daughter, no longer the hidden shame. She was a woman who had found her own strength, her own value, and a man who saw her exactly as she was and loved her for it. 6 months after the confrontation with Carlos, Sofia's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. Vittorio had made their union official through a private ceremony. It wasn't a traditional wedding, since their lives weren't traditional, but it was a real commitment, witnessed by those who really mattered. More importantly, Sofia had found her purpose. With Vittorio's support, she established a foundation that helped vulnerable children, orphans, and young people at risk of being exploited by criminal organizations. Ironically, the woman who had been treated as disposable by her own family now dedicated her life to protecting those society also considered disposable. Vittorio, in turn, discovered that Sofia not only complemented his personal life, but also improved his business. She had a unique perspective, managing to see angles he missed. More importantly, she was his conscience, reminding him of his own rules when the line between acceptable and unacceptable became blurred. Vittorio's henchman, who had initially looked at Sofia with disdain, now genuinely respected her. Marco frequently commented that the boss was more balanced, less prone to outbursts of anger since Sofia entered his life. She humanized him, reminding him there was more in the world than power and control. One afternoon, while working together in the library that had become their favorite shared space, Vittorio stopped reviewing documents and simply looked at Sofia. She felt his gaze and raised her eyes from the book she was reading. She asked if something was wrong. Vittorio shook his head. He said he was just thinking about how strange and unpredictable life was. Sofia waited for him to elaborate. Vittorio admitted that when he made that demand to the Monteros, a daughter in exchange for the debt, it was out of cruelty, a way to punish Carlos for his dishonesty and arrogance. He never expected them to actually send someone, much less that they would send Sofia. And when she arrived, when he realized the Monteros had tried to deceive him by sending the daughter they kept hidden out of shame, he was furious. He felt deeply insulted. But now, months later, Vittorio realized the delicious irony of the situation. The Monteros thought they were playing a trick on him, getting rid of an unwanted daughter and a debt at the same time. Instead, they had inadvertently delivered exactly what he had been searching for all his life without knowing. A woman with inner strength, unwavering integrity, genuine compassion, and courage to face any situation. A true companion, in the deepest sense of the word. Sofia smiled. She admitted she also saw the irony. Her family had spent 23 years making her feel her value was non-existent, that she was ashamed to be hidden. Then they discarded her in the cruelest way they could imagine, but by doing so, they freed her. They sent her to the only place where she would be truly seen, valued, and loved. The supposed punishment had become the greatest blessing of her life. Vittorio stood up and went to her. He knelt beside her chair, holding her hands. He said he loved her, not despite who she was, but exactly because of who she was. Every quality her family considered a defect, he considered precious. Sofia felt tears of happiness fill her eyes. She replied that she also loved him, that he had taught her that real value has nothing to do with appearance or what others think. It has to do with character, with choices, with how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return. They kissed, sealing a love that had been born from the most unlikely circumstances, but which was real and deep in ways that surprised them both daily. The Montero family had tried to discard Sofia as if she were trash. Instead, they had delivered a treasure to the only man capable of recognizing her true value. And so, the fat daughter who was sent as payment and insult became the beloved woman who transformed the heart of one of the most feared men in the region. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst curses, and sometimes the people who try to hurt us end up directing us to our true destiny. Sofia was no longer defined by her appearance or her family's rejection. She was defined by her strength, her compassion, and the love of a man who saw her exactly as she was, perfect in her imperfection, valuable in her authenticity, loved in her completeness. 2 years later, Sofia's foundation had grown exponentially. They had helped hundreds of children, offering not just shelter and education, but also dignity and hope. Vittorio still operated his businesses in the shadows, but with Sofia by his side, his operations had become more ethical, more focused on protecting the vulnerable than simply accumulating power. The news arrived through Rosa, the housekeeper. The Montero family had lost everything. The mansion would be auctioned. Carlos had been arrested for fraud. Helena and the daughters were living with distant relatives, depending on others' charity. Sofia received the news without joy, but also without sadness. She felt only a kind of peace. They had made their choices, and now lived with the consequences. She didn't wish them harm, but also felt no obligation to save them. The only person from the family Sofia kept in contact with was the grandmother. The old lady, now living in a modest nursing home, received regular visits and financial support from Sofia. It was the grandmother who revealed one last detail that closed the circle completely. The lady told that on the night before Sophia was sent away, she had prayed. She asked the universe that, if her granddaughter had to leave that house of cruelty, that at least it would be to a place where she could be truly happy. And mysteriously, the prayer had been answered. The family thought they were committing the final act of cruelty. Instead, they had freed Sophia to find her true destiny. Sophia shared this story with Vittorio that night. He embraced her, marveling at how life had strange ways of correcting injustices, how sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the worst moments. They stood on the mansion's veranda, looking at the stars, two survivors who had found in each other something they didn't even know they were looking for. The fat daughter, who was sent as insult and payment. The Mafia boss, who expected to receive a beautiful prisoner to use as revenge. Both had found something much more valuable. They had found true love, mutual respect, and a partnership that completed them in ways they never imagined possible.